Hi guys, tonight's story welcome, weary traveler. Tuck yourself in, fluff up your pillow, and get cozy. Tonight, we're going back in time, way back to the frosty heart of the Middle Ages. No dragons or knights tonight, sorry, just cold feet, empty bellies, and the kind of weather that makes you great fuel imager in its winter. It's dark outside. Actually, it's been dark since, like, 4 p.m. There's no electric lights, no warm showers, no hot cocoa. You're in a small wooden house, with holes in the roof, a dirt floor, and a smoky fireplace that's doing its best, but mostly just makes your eyes water. Welcome to winter in medieval Europe. It's not just cold, it's brutal. The big chill medieval winters weren't exactly gentle. The period we're talking about, roughly the 5th to the 15th century, includes what historians call the Little Ice Age, not a full-on frozen tundra or anything, but definitely colder than what we're used to today. Shorter growing seasons, colder temperatures, longer winters. If you think February is depressing now, imagine it without socks. People didn't have thermostats. They judged the cold by whether their ale froze, or if the chickens refused to come out of the coop. When rivers froze over, it was both magical and miserable. Some towns turned it into a party, holding fairs on the frozen Thames in London, for instance. But still, once the frost set in, life got harder for everyone. No heat. No problem. Oh wait, let's talk heating or lack of it. The average medieval home was built for basic survival, not comfort. Most common folk lived in one-room huts with wooden beams, wattle and door walls that's mud and straw, and maybe a thatched roof that leaked when it snowed. Inside, you'd find a fire pit or a hearth in the middle of the room. Chimneys weren't even a thing in many homes until the late Middle Ages, so smoke just kind of drifted out a hole in the roof, or didn't, which meant people were cold and coughing. And forget fireplaces in every room. If you were lucky, you had one. Most people slept, cooked, and lived around that one smoky source of warmth. At night, they might let the fire burn out and just bury hot coals in ash to relight in the morning. Romantic, maybe. Practical, barely. Cold wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. The thing about medieval cold, it could kill you. Frostbite, sure, but it wasn't just that. The cold weakened immune systems, made people more vulnerable to illness, and froze water sources. People drank ale more than water, partly because it was safer. But it was also harder to freeze. Priorities. Winter also meant food scarcity, isolation, and more accidents. Slipping on ice wasn't just embarrassing, it could break bones, and broken bones without modern medicine didn't heal so well. Even nobles in castles weren't safe. Sure, they had thicker walls and maybe a fur-lined cloak or two, but castles were made of stone, and stone gets very cold. Ever sat on a stone toilet in January? That's the medieval experience. When the sun just stopped showing up. Let's not forget the sheer darkness of medieval winter. With no electricity, your day was pretty much over when the sun went down. People relied on candles or oil lamps, but those weren't cheap, so most folks just went to bed early. We're talking 14 to 16 hours of darkness. That's a long time to sit around. People slept more in winter, sometimes into chunks, the so-called first sleep and second sleep. In between, they might pray, talk, snack, or just lie there in the dark trying to ignore the sound of rats. And with long nights came more time to think, worrying, or stew over things. Anxiety and seasonal sadness existed even back then, though they didn't have a name for it. Winter was a time of waiting for food to grow again, waiting for warmth to return, waiting for daylight to stick around longer than a few hours. Clothes, layer it on or freeze. Winter fashion in the Middle Ages wasn't about looking cute. It was about survival. Most folks had one or two outfits, usually made of itchy wool, and they layered them as best they could. Underclothes, tunics, cloaks, shawls, hoods, fur if you could afford it. But wool was the MVP. It retained heat, even when damp. And believe me, everything was damp. Shoes were often just leather soleless with no insulation, so cold feet were the default. Gloves, luxury. Scarves, not unless you made one yourself. And at night, people bundled under as many blankets as they had, sometimes sharing beds for warmth. Even with livestock in some households, nothing like a goat's breath on your face to say good morning. Rich or poor, winter didn't carry all. Lords and nobles had some advantages. They could afford more food, better clothes, and servants to fetch firewood. But even they couldn't escape the season entirely. Their castles might have been grand, but they were drafty. Those big banquet halls, freezing, high ceilings just meant the heat rose away from you faster. And tapestries, while beautiful, were often more about insulation than decoration. So while the rich may have eaten better and worn finer furs, even they huddled by the fire, shivering and sniffling like everyone else. Survival was a team sport. Communities often relied on each other to get through winter. Families gathered around the fire. Neighbors helped each other when they could. Elders passed down winter wisdom: how to store grain, keep livestock alive, or wrap your feet with straw inside your shoes. People told stories, sang songs, played games, and celebrated feast days, not just for fun, but to keep their spirits alive. Because when the cold stretched on, and the food got thin, sometimes hope was all you had. Why even talk about this? You might be wondering, why focus on something so bleak? Isn't this supposed to help me sleep? Well, sometimes learning about other people's struggles, especially from the past, makes us feel grateful or curious, or just oddly comforted, knowing humans have been surviving winters for a very, very long time. And even though medieval winters were rough, people endured. They huddled, they hoped, they told stories by the fire, just like we're doing now, in our own modern, cozy way. So close your eyes now, let the flickering torchlight fade. Outside, snow falls softly on thatched roofs. Inside, a medieval family pulls the blankets tighter and settles into their wooden bed. The wind howls, but the fire crackles, and somewhere, deep in history, another winter begins. Frozen to the bone. How cold it really wastes. Little Ice Age spoiler. It wasn't that little, so remember when we mentioned the Little Ice Age? Let's dig into that a bit. It wasn't an ice age like the one with mammoths and saber-toothed tigers, but it was still a long, chilly stretch. From about the 1300s to the mid-1800s, Europe went through a period of colder than usual winters, shorter summers, and longer stretches of gloomy, wet weather. It wasn't freezing every day, but it was enough to change lives. Rivers froze, crops failed, and people grumbled a lot. Monks recorded brutal snowstorms in their dusty little chronicles. Peasants cursed the skies, and everyone, everywhere, just tried to stay warm. Nature's icy mood swings, and of the worst parts, the unpredictability. One year might be okay. The next, a deep freeze, sudden snow in October, or frost that lingered till May. Medieval folks didn't have fancy weather apps or satellite forecasts. They had clouds, old sayings, and aching joints. Red sky at night. Shepherd's delight was about as close as you got to meteorology. So when winter came hard and fast, it caught everyone off guard. There are records of the River Thames in London freezing solid, not just a thin layer either thick, enough to hold markets, bonfires, and even dancing. Sounds festive, until you remember. The river freezing meant no fresh fish, no easy travel, and a whole lot of trouble. Frost on the inside of your house, let's paint a picture. It's late December, you wake up, still wrapped in all the clothes you own. You look at the wooden beam above your head and, yep, it's got frost on it, on the inside. There's ice on the water bucket beside your bed. Your breath fogs the air, and the fire's gone out. Again, this wasn't rare. Medieval houses, especially in northern Europe, weren't built for deep winter. They had gaps, holes, drafts, stone walls that sucked away every bit of warmth. Even when a fire was burning, it heated the area around it, not the whole room. People stayed as close to the flames as they could without catching on fire, which, yes, did happen from time to time. Windows, if you had any, they were either open holes or maybe covered in thin animal skin or oiled parchment. Basically, just enough to keep the birds out. Cold air still came in, it paid rent, breath, fog, and ice covered everything. Your breath misted in front of your face all day long. Outside, obvious, but also inside, in church, in bed, at the dinner table. People got used to it. In fact, travellers would write about how their clothes crackled with frost when they got up in the morning. Beards froze, ale turned slushy in the mug. In some cases, ink froze in the wells, making writing letters or monthly manuscripts annoyingly impossible. And while snow could be pretty, it was also dangerous. It covered everything. Roofs caved in, paths disappeared, animals got lost in it, or were stuck and frozen where they stood. Not ideal if you're depending on that goat to give you milk. Cold fingers, aching bones. You know that awful feeling when your fingers stop working from the cold. Imagine living with that all the time. Gloves were rare and often homemade. Some folks just wrapped rags around their hands. Others shoved them under their armpits when not in use. Elegant, no, effective. Sometimes, and the cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it hurt. Joints ached, teeth chattered, noses ran constantly. Medieval medicine didn't have the concept of seasonal depression or arthritis flare-ups, but people sure felt it. They knew winter made them slower, sadder, and more tired, especially the elderly. There are even reports of people losing toes or fingers to frostbite, which, without antibiotics, often meant infection, which, in turn, could mean, well, let's just say you weren't going to bounce back with a band-aid and a cup of tea. Hot baths. Hilarious. What about warming up with a hot bath? You ask. Not really. Most peasants didn't bathe often, maybe once or twice a year. And even for those with access to a bathhouse, heating water was expensive and time-consuming. You had to lug it from the well or river, then boil it, then fill a tub by hand. So unless you were extremely lucky or a monk with access to a warm abbey, you just stayed cold and stinky. To be fair, everyone else was stinky too, so it probably didn't feel that weird. Snow days. Nope. Modern winters can be inconvenient, sure, but at least we get snow days, right? School cancelled, work from home, hot drinks and fuzzy socks. Medieval people, they didn't get a break. Snow meant more work, shoveling paths, clearing thatch, keeping animals from freezing, finding firewood buried under drifts. It meant slipping on icy mud and breaking a leg that couldn't be set properly. It meant food stores being harder to access. It meant danger. Even travel became almost impossible. Carts couldn't get through snow. Roads turned to slush or ice. Horses could fall. Merchants stayed home, which meant fewer goods, higher prices, and less news from the outside world. The cold shrank the world. Sleep was its own battle. Cold didn't leave you alone at night either. Blankets were rare and expensive. Most people just piled on extra clothes, or huddled together like penguins, sometimes even with animals, dogs, goats, the occasional chicken. Livestock in the house meant warmth, and warmth meant survival. People also slept in shifts. That first sleep or second sleep thing we mentioned last time, it came partly from necessity. Fires needed tending. Babies needed feeding. Someone needed to check that snow wasn't collapsing the roof. Nighttime was long and rarely peaceful. Even in the middle of the night, the cold stayed with you. Your breath rose in clouds. You pulled the blanket tighter. And if the fire burned out, someone had to get up and coax it back to life, usually with frozen hands. But still, they got through it. Is the strange and wonderful thing. They survived. Despite the cold, despite the endless dark, people lived through these winters. They found ways to cope, to endure, to even laugh sometimes, because what else can you do when your ale is frozen, your socks are straw, and your chicken is sleeping under your bed? They told stories by the fire. They gathered close and shared warmth. They waited for spring with hope in their hearts, even if their noses were red and runny the whole time. So now, as you lay there under your modern, cozy blankets, maybe give a little nod to the past. Imagine the cold creeping under a wooden door, the frost on the inside of the window. Imagine huddling close to the hearth, the smell of wood smoke, the silence of snow falling outside. You're warmer now, safer, but the stories stay with us. Home sweet icebox. Living in medieval houses. Basics, dirt, straw, and drafts first. Let's be clear. The average medieval home wasn't a castle. It wasn't even a cottage like the ones you see in fairy tales. It was small, cramped, orphan, built from whatever materials were lying around: wood, mud, straw, and maybe some stones if you were lucky. The floor, dirt, literally just dirt. No tiles, no wood, no carpet. In winter, it turned to mud. People sometimes scattered straw or rushes to keep it slightly less gross, but that didn't stop the cold from seeping through. All the bugs. Walls were made of wattle and daub, that's woven wooden sticks coated with mud and dung. It worked mostly, but it didn't keep the wind out. And it definitely didn't keep the heat in. One room to rule them. Almost families lived in a single room structure. That one room had to do everything: sleeping, cooking, eating, working, and sheltering animals. Yes, animals, chickens, goats, sometimes even a cow, especially in the winter. It was warmer that way, for them and for you. There might be a loft or platform above for sleeping, especially if the roof was tall enough. But for the most part, everything happened in that one space. Imagine trying to sleep while your goat is chewing hay 2 feet away, and your brother is snoring on the other side. Romantic? Not exactly. But it was practical. Body heat helped. Closeness meant survival. Doors and windows, more like holes. Really know about the doors and windows. Doors were heavy wooden planks, maybe with some leather hinges if someone was feeling fancy. They didn't seal tightly. Cold air came in whether you wanted it or not. Windows, tiny slits or square holes. In wealthier homes, they might be covered in thin animal bladder or oiled cloth to let in light while keeping out drafts. But glass, that was rare and expensive. Most folks just stuffed straw or rags in the window holes when the wind picked up. So, yes, the indoors was still a windy place to be. The line between inside and outside was more of a suggestion than a guarantee. The roof, thatched and Iffy's roof, typically thatched, was made of straw or reeds layered thick and tied tightly together. It worked well until it didn't. Heavy snow could cause parts to sag or collapse. Birds sometimes nested in it, and if it wasn't well maintained, it leaked. But here's the catch: thatch insulated. It trapped heat better than tiles or slate. So even though it could catch fire, more on that later, people stuck with it. The smoke from the central hearth would rise and drift up into the thatch before escaping through a hole in the roof. The downside: smoke stained everything. The upside: it sometimes smoked out the fleas and bugs. The hearth, fire and frustration at the heart of the home literally was the hearth. It wasn't a fireplace like we think of today. More often, it was just a stone-lined pit in the middle of the floor with a fire burning and a kettle or cauldron hanging above it. There was no chimney in many homes. The smoke just wafted out through a smoke hole or cracks in the roof, which means the air inside was usually thick with soot. People walked around with red eyes, coughs, and blackened noses. But hey, at least the fire was warm if you sat right next to it. And wood, not easy to come by. Firewood had to be collected and dried. Cutting down trees wasn't always allowed, especially on the Lord's land, so families rationed it. Fires were kept small or banked to smoulder overnight. Ash was used to insulate embers until morning, a roaring fire. Not unless you were rich or reckless. Furniture, minimal at best. There wasn't much in the way of furniture. A bench, a table, maybe a chest for storage. Beds, if you had them, were wooden frames with ropes or leather straps and a straw mattress on top. Think of it like sleeping on a crunchy bale of hay that pokes you in the back if you move wrong. Blankets were wool, heavy and often shared. Beds were usually communal. Parents, kids, maybe even a neighbor's kid, as they were staying over during a storm. And no wardrobes. Clothes were hung on pegs or draped over furniture to dry by the fire, which made for a very smoky wardrobe smell. Smells like everything. Let's talk about the smells. Imagine a room full of people, animals, food, dirt, and smoke. Add in wet straw and old boots. And no one's bathed since Easter. Medieval people didn't expect their homes to smell nice. They just expected them to not be deadly. In winter, they couldn't open the windows to air things out. So everything just lingered. Herbs like lavender or rosemary were sometimes scattered on the floor to freshen the air. Mostly, they got trampled into the dirt, but it was a nice try, keeping the cold out. Barely people did their best to stay warm. They hung tapestries or woven mats on the walls, partly for decoration, but mostly to block drafts. Animal skins were used as rugs or extra blankets. Curtains were drawn around beds, if you had a bed, to trap body heat. In wealthier homes, separate rooms existed: a kitchen, a hall, maybe even a private warm room. But even those rooms were freezing most of the time. A single fire couldn't do much in a stone-walled room with 10-foot ceilings. So people stayed in one room together, huddled close. Kids sat by the fire while the adults worked. Animals breathed steam into the cold air. And everyone dreamed of spring. Risks of indoor winter living, and there were hazards. Fires sometimes escaped the hearth and set thatch roofs ablaze, with no fire department to call. It could take down an entire house or worse, a whole row of them. Indoor smoke also caused lung issues. Children growing up in smoky homes had chronic coughs. Many adults did to dots, and then there were the rats, fleas, and other uninvited guests. Winter drove them indoors too, looking for warmth and crumbs. Somehow. Still home despite it all. This one room, dirt-floored, smoky icebox was home. It was where families laughed, told stories, ate stew, and made it through long winters together. It might have been cold and dark and filled with the sounds of snoring pigs and creaky beams, but it was shelter. And in the Middle Ages, that meant everything. So as you lie there in your warm, quiet room tonight, imagine a crackling hearth, the distant bleat of a goat, and the soft scratch of straw beneath your feet. Outside, snow gathers quietly. Inside, a medieval family wraps up in wool, waiting for morning. Sleep well, traveler. Next time, we'll talk about how that fire got started. And all the trouble it brought with it. Fire hazards and cold kitchens. Heating most eternal struggle. Heat versus not dying of smoke inhalation. So, here's the situation. It's winter, you're cold, you light a fire. But your house is made of wood, straw, thatch, and dried mud. There's no chimney, at least not yet. Chimneys only started showing up around the 12th or 13th century, and even then, they were mostly for the rich. So, smoke goes everywhere, up your nose, in your eyes, into your lungs. Most medieval homes had a central hearth, a fire pit in the middle of the room. The smoke was supposed to drift up and out through a hole in the ceiling. But wind didn't always cooperate. Sometimes it just swirled right back in your face. If you've ever lit a campfire on a windy day, you get it. By the end of the night, your walls were blackened, your clothes smelled like a smoked sausage, and your lungs. Well, let's just say you coughed a lot. Lighting the fire, not as easy as it sounds. Matches didn't exist. Lighters. Nope. Fire was something you had to keep going, or risk starting from scratch. The safest and most common method. Banking the fire. At night, you'd cover hot coals with ash to smother the flame, but keep the embers glowing. In the morning, you'd uncover them, add kindling, and hopefully the fire would catch again. If it did in single quotes, well, time to beg fire from your neighbor. Or use flint and steel to try and spark a new one, which could take forever. If things were damp, some folks kept a candle or smoldering coal in a clay pot all day, just in case. Others used fire wheels, bow drills, or other painfully slow friction methods. Let's just say you really didn't want your fire to go out. Kitchens without kitchens. There weren't many kitchens the way we know them today. Most homes had just the one hearth for cooking, heating, lighting, and sometimes drying laundry. Everything happened in that little smoky circle. In wealthier homes, there might be a separate kitchen, a stone room with an oven and a chimney, but for peasants, meals were boiled over an open flame. No temperature control, no timers, no oven mitts. If you got distracted, your dinner turned into charcoal. In some villages, there were communal bake ovens. Families would take their bread dough to a shared oven, kind of like a medieval pizza parlor, but colder and much, much sadder. Firewood, the original gold. You couldn't stay warm, cook food without wood, and wood didn't just fall from the sky. Okay, sometimes it did, but it still had to be gathered, chopped, and stored. Peasants often spent hours collecting fallen branches from forests. But cutting down trees was a different matter. Forests were usually owned by nobles, and stealing wood, yes, even just a log, was considered poaching, and poaching could land you in serious trouble. Like, lose an ear trouble. So families rationed what they had. They burned peat, straw, animal dung, whatever would catch fire. Drying dung patties by the hearth and stacking them for winter was totally normal, not exactly scented candles, but it got the job done. Kitchen disasters, burned bread and burned homes with open flames everywhere and flammable materials all around. Fire was a constant danger. It wasn't if something would catch it, it was when thatched roofs were basically fire magnets. A single stray spark could light up the whole house in seconds, especially during winter when roofs were dry and winds were high. If your home burned down, there was no insurance, no fire brigade. Neighbors might help put it out by tossing water from buckets or beating it with wet rags, but often they were just trying to keep it from spreading to their house. Cooking disasters were common. Bread got burned, pots boiled over, people knocked kettles into the fire. Kids playing too close got scorched. Even seasoned cooks had scars. You didn't just check on dinner, you braced for it. Cold kitchens, cold food, and yet, with all that effort, the kitchen still wasn't warm most of the time. Fire warmed the air right around it. If you stepped a feet away, you were cold again. And since the fire was often small, just big enough to cook, heating the whole room wasn't an option. Food cooled quickly. Porridge that was hot when served might be lukewarm by the time it hit your bowl. Stayed in the pot until the very last second. Bread was often eaten cold and tough, and drinks, unless you had a warmed ale or mulled wine, your beverage was colder than the weather. There's even evidence that people kept food close to their bodies to stop it from freezing. Tuck that cheese under your arm, it's dinner and insulation. Cooking in layers clothing was a big part of survival in the kitchen. Cooks wore layers, aprons, wool hoods. Women often used long sleeves to grab hot pots instead of pot holders. Smart, but risky. Smoky eyes. Normal, burned eyebrows. Occupational hazard. Cooking in winter was a job that required patience, bravery, and a high tolerance for coughing fits. There were no recipes, timers, or measuring cups. Just instinct, muscle memory, and a little hope. If something turned out edible, it was a good day. If it didn't catch fire, it was a great day. What about the rich folks? Sure, nobles had more firepower, literally. They had multiple hearths, better stoves, chimney systems, and actual servants to do all the dangerous stuff. Their kitchens were still cold, though. Stone walls sucked in every bit of heat. Fireplaces were huge, but they had to be constantly fed. And kitchens were often separate from the main castle to avoid fire risk, which meant carrying hot food over icy courtyards. Fancy soup now served cold. And even in those grand kitchens, fires still caused problems. Kitchens caught fire in monasteries, manors, and castles all the time. There's even a story of an entire feast being ruined because the cook fell into the oven. No word on whether they saved the roast. Fire, friend and foe. So fire was everything. It was comfort, warmth, food, and life, but it was also smoke, burns, danger, and destruction. In a world without electricity or gas, it ruled every household and demanded constant respect. One careless moment could mean a ruined meal. A second careless moment could mean losing your home. And so, every winter night, as the wind howled outside and the snow piled high, people huddled near their little flames, watching, tending, hoping it would last until morning. So now, as you rest in your modern home with your fire alarm, electric stove, a microwave burrito, spare a thought for the medieval cook. Eyes red, sleeves singed, nose running, trying not to catch the house on fire. Just to make soup. The winter diet, cold gruel, and questionable so ... Where's the food? First things first. In winter, nothing grows. Farms went quiet after the fall harvest. Fields were too cold, soil was frozen, and even hardy plants went dormant. That meant people had to survive for several months on whatever they managed to store, preserve, pickle, or dry during the warmer months. If they stored too little, or the weather had been cruel, winter meant hunger. Or worse, famine. There were no supermarkets, no frozen food section, no just order something nights. If you didn't have it in your cellar, or your neighbor didn't have it, you probably weren't eating it until spring. The pantry. Not exactly packed, so what was in a medieval winter pantry? Dried legumes, beans, peas, and lentils. Not exactly exciting, but filling. Grain and flour. If you were lucky, you had sacks of barley or rye, salted meat or fish, heavily salted and stored in barrels. Needed soaking before cooking. Hard cheeses. These lasted longer than soft ones. Also, very hard to chew. Onions and garlic, stored hanging from beams like smelly holiday decorations. Ale and mead, because clean water wasn't a guarantee. And hey, calories. Turnips, the vegetable that just wouldn't die. Cabbage, a winter staple. And yes, your house would smell like it. Fresh fruits. Nope. Greens, not unless you were very lucky. Spices. Only if you were rich, had something to trade. The star of the show. Porridge. If you lived in the Middle Ages, you ate porridge, a lot, made from whatever grain was cheapest and available. Barley, oats, rye porridge was the medieval answer to pretty much every meal. It was boiled with water or watered down milk and served hot if you were lucky, or cold and stiff if you weren't. It was filling, it was cheap, it was bland. Think oatmeal, but without sugar, cinnamon, or even hope. Sometimes people added bits of vegetable, dried fruit, or herbs. But often it was just ... grain mush, morning, noon, and night. Stew. Glorious kinda stews were another staple. And by stew, we mean a pot of boiling water with whatever was lying around tossed in. Bits of salted pork, some beans, maybe a carrot, or the heel of a loaf of bread, or a rat. Okay, not always a rat, but you never know. The stew pot stayed on the fire all day. Some called it perpetual stew because you never really emptied it. You just kept adding to it. A slice of turnip here, a bone there. Stir it, boil it, and hope it tastes edible. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and kept bellies from growling too loudly. Bread that could break your teeth. Bread was life in the Middle Ages, but not the soft, fluffy kind, more like dry, dark loaves that doubled as paper, a weights. Poorer folks ate black bread, made from rye or barley, sometimes mixed with oat husks or peas. Wheat bread was reserved for the rich. It was whiter, softer, and didn't taste like sadness. And in winter, bread got even harder, literally. It dried out quickly and was often dunked in stew or aled just to soften it enough to chew. Some used bread as plates called trenchers. After a meal, the soggy slab of bread was either eaten, tossed to animals, or given to beggars. Preserving food. The salt life without fridges. Preserving food was a full-time job. Salting was one of the most common methods. Meat or fish would be packed in barrels of salt and stored in cool places like cellars. Pickling was also popular. Cabbage, onions, and even eggs went into vinegar-filled jars. Dried herbs and smoked meats added some flavor when available, but preserved food didn't always taste good. Salty meat had to be soaked and boiled to get the salt out. Pickled things were sharp and sour. And sometimes food went bad anyway. People were used to eating things slightly off. Mouldy cheese, scrape it, spoiled stew. Add more herbs and boil it again. Bon appetit. Fasting. But not by choice. The church declared a lot of fast days: no meat, no dairy, no eggs. Lent was especially strict, but many peasants fasted simply because they had no choice. By February, many homes had run low on everything. The winter food stores were nearly gone, and spring crops hadn't come in yet. This was called the hunger gap. Some years, it was a small struggle. Other years, it was deadly. People stretched meals, skipped meals, and hoped for charity from monasteries or local lords. For the very poor, winter was not just hard, it was dangerous. Drinks. Just don't drink the water. Water wasn't always safe to drink. Wells could freeze. Streams were full of waste. So people drank ale, weak small beer with low alcohol, but enough to kill some germs. It was safer, and more importantly, it was hydrating. Warm drinks like broth, mulled wine, or spiced ale were occasional comforts, but for the average peasant, it was cold ale or nothing. Milk, if available, was often used quickly or turned into cheese. And snow, not really a drink option. Clean snow was rare, and frozen water buckets weren't exactly refreshing. Winter treats, yes, there were a few. Despite everything, there were little pleasures. Sweetened dishes, for example, using honey or dried fruits. Spiced puddings during holidays, pancakes on Shrove Tuesday, even meat pies. If you had a lucky hunting day or a generous lord, your feast brought out the good stuff: roasted birds, glazed nuts, warm bread, and cakes. But those treats were rare and seasonal. The rest of winter, back to porridge, eating together, staying together. Meals were shared, often from one pot or bowl. Spoons were used, but knives were personal. Forks weren't common. People dipped, scooped, and slurped together. It wasn't glamorous, but it built community. Even in the coldest months, families gathered close, shared what little they had, and made the best of it. A cold meal with company was better than a warm one alone. So, as you finish your bedtime snack, sip your tea. Spare a thought for someone in the year 1340, poking at their suspiciously green stew and wondering if chewing on a boot might be tastier. But they made it through, winter after winter. One bowl of gruel at a time. Sleep tight. And next time, we'll talk about what happened when all that food ran out. The Great Freeze, farming, food shortages, and famine. Farming doesn't work when the earth is frozen. Let's start with the obvious. Farming stops in winter. The ground is too hard to dig. Seeds won't grow. Plants die off. Animals eat more but produce less. And you can't exactly plow a snow-covered field. Medieval farmers knew this. That's why summer and autumn were frantic times of harvesting, drying, preserving, and storing. They weren't preparing for a cozy season by the fire. They were stocking up like squirrels before a storm. But if the harvest was poor, winter became dangerous. When the harvest fails, bad harvests happened all the time. Maybe it rained too much. Maybe it didn't rain at all. Maybe hail came through and wrecked the wheat. Or frost arrived too early. Or pests ate everything. Or war swept through and trampled the fields. Any of those meant that less food was gathered. That meant less bread, less porridge, fewer vegetables. And what was available? Prices soared. Worse still, people had to start dipping into their winter reserves early. So by January or February, cellars were already getting empty. The dreaded hunger gap. I mentioned this briefly last chapter, but it deserves its own spotlight. The hunger gap was that bleak stretch between late winter and early spring, when nothing fresh was growing and the stored food had nearly run out. February and March were the worst. Cabbage barrels were empty, beans were gone, bread was hard, a stone or completely moldy. Families started skipping meals, or sharing a single bowl of soup between 6 people. If you were poor, you might go an entire day or 2 without real food. And if help didn't come, from the church, from your Lord, from a kind neighbor, then your options got darker. Famine, when the whole village starves for means, weren't just personal tragedies. They hit entire regions, towns, kingdoms. A single bad harvest might cause hunger, but 2 or 3 bad years in a row, that's when famine settled in, like a cold fog that wouldn't lift. The Great Famine of 1317 was a famous example. It rained 4 months, crops rotted, livestock drowned in the mud or starved. People ate their seed grain, the stuff meant for next year's planting, just to survive the day. That famine killed millions. Skeletons were found in mass graves. People died in the streets. Some records mention people eating grass. Or worse, desperation makes people do strange things during the worst winters. The rules started to bend, or break. People ate things they normally wouldn't: tree bark, boiled leather, shoe sawless, rats, dogs, cats. There are even whispers in medieval chronicles, grim, half-buried lines, about cannibalism during extreme famines. Desperate, terrible choices made by people with no other option. It's horrifying. But it reminds us just how brutal life could be when the frost stayed too long and food disappeared. The role of the church in maritime monasteries often played a huge role in helping people survive winter. They stored extra grain. They had better access to preserved goods, and feeding the poor was considered a holy duty. In fact, some monks dedicated their lives to feeding the hungry and caring for the sick during famines. But even the monasteries had limits. During bad years, their stores ran dry too. Long lines formed at the abbey gates. Soup kitchens, if you can call them that, ran out fast, and there were always more mouths than food. Lords, nobles, and the sharing problem. What about the local lord? After all, he had plenty, right? Well, maybe. But nobles were focused on feeding their own households, their family, soldiers, and horses, and they weren't always eager to give away food for free. Some lords helped during hard winters. Others raised taxes even higher to pay for their own supplies, or they hoarded grain, knowing they could sell it later at higher prices. To be fair, some did provide work or handed out loaves of bread, but it wasn't guaranteed. If your lord was generous, winter might be survivable. If not, you were on your own. Migration, theft, and begging. One local food source is dried up. People moved. Villages emptied. Families wandered the roads in search of work or bread. Many turned to begging. Some stole. Others joined outlaw bands in the forest, robbing travelers just to eat. Crime rose sharply during famines, and the punishments harsh. Steal a loaf of bread, and you might lose a hand. Or worse. But for many, that was still better than starving quietly. The emotional toll of hunger beyond the physical pain. Winter. Hunger took a mental toll. Imagine trying to sleep when your stomach growled so loudly it echoed in your skull. Or watching your children pick at empty bowls. Or realizing your seed grain, the food that should grow next year's crop, was now bubbling in a pot because there was nothing else. Hunger haunted people. It crept into their dreams, into their prayers, into the stories they told. Entire Folk tales grew around magical feasts, bottomless pots of stew, bread that never ran out, because in winter, hunger was the villain, and food was the fantasy. Hope in the darkness. And yet, people endured. They planted again in spring, even if their stomachs were still empty. They shared what they could. They told jokes around the fire. They sang songs, even when their voices shook. Villages held on to each other, because that was the only way through. If you gave your neighbor your last onion today, maybe he'd bring you a fish tomorrow. It wasn't about surviving alone. It was about enduring together. So tonight, as you rest with a full belly and a warm blanket, remember how far we've come, and how many winter nights were once spent hungry, cold, and afraid. Sleep softly. You are not in 1316. The cupboards are full, and the porridge is, thankfully, optional. Bundled up, medieval winter clothing and layering like a Turner player one, the linen bay surprise. Under all those heavy winter clothes, the first layer was usually something soft and simple. Linen. Linen was the medieval version of underwear. Men wore linen shirts and breeches. Women had long linen smocks. These garments were light, breathable, and, when not soaked with snow melt, surprisingly cozy. And here's the fun part. They were rarely washed. Yes, people slept in them, sweated in them, worked in them, and wore them for days, weeks, even. In winter, changing clothes was more of a suggestion than a rule. The star of the show, wool. The true hero of medieval winters, wool was everywhere. Tunics, cloaks, hats, hoods, gloves, socks. It was warm, even when damp. It was durable. It could be thick or thin, rough or fine. If you were rich, you wore nice wool. If you were poor, you wore scratchy wool, and lots of it. People layered their wool garments one on top of the other. Tunic over a shirt, a cloak over the tunic, maybe another tunic under the cloak, a hat on the hat, mittens over gloves. You get the idea. They basically wore their closets. It wasn't about fashion. It was about not turning into a medieval popsicle. Cloaks and mantles, portable blankets, the most iconic winter garment. The cloak, big, heavy, and dramatic. Cloaks were made of thick wool and pinned at the neck or shoulder. They covered everything. Some were hooded. Others were just long fabric rectangles that you wrapped around yourself like a burrito. They kept the wind out and the warmth in. Bonus, you could sleep in one like a makeshift sleeping bag. Some even had fur linings for that extra touch of luxury, or at least warmth. And if you were fancy, you might have a mantle, a type of cloak that screamed, "Look at me, I have money and I'm warm." Footwear, cold, muddy, and sad. Now here's where it gets less fun. Medieval shoes were usually made of leather. Thin leather, soft leather, not waterproof leather. They weren't great for snow or rain or slush, and they definitely didn't have insulation or thick sawless. So people stuffed them with straw or cloth for extra warmth. Some wore multiple pairs of wool socks, some just got wet feet and dealt with it. Boots existed, yes, but they weren't common for the average peasant. Nobles might have fancier leather boots lined with fur, but most folks had simple shoes and cold toes. Sorry, medieval feet. You deserved better. Hands and heads. Cover everything. Keeping your head warm was essential. Heat escapes quickly, and there were no beanies or hoodies. Instead, people wore woolen caps, like floppy beanies, coifs, close-fitting linen, or wool caps tied under the chin. Hoods, sometimes attached to cloaks, sometimes separate. Hoods were actually pretty versatile. You could pull them down when indoors, or wrap them around your neck like a scarf. Some even had liripipes, long, pointy towels, which were either stylish or just good for flinging at siblings. As for hands, warm mittens were common, leather gloves if you were lucky, and sometimes nothing, because gloves wear out, and making new ones took time, money, and a good chunk of animal. Fur. If you had it, you wore it. Fur was very warm and very expensive. So naturally, it was a status symbol. The poor might line their cloaks with rabbit or sheepskin. The rich, they went big, squirrel, fox, badger, beaver, even ermine for royalty. For dash-lined boots, fur collars, fur hats, fur-trimmed sleeves. It was cozy, luxurious, and slightly terrifying if you stopped to count how many animals it took to make one noble's outfit. But hey, when it's minus 10 degrees Celsius and snowing sideways, a bit of fluffy badger on your boots doesn't seem like such a bad idea. Women's winter fashion. Layers, layers, layers. Women wore long linen underdresses, shifts, with woolen gowns or overdresses on top. Then came cloaks, hoods, shawls, mittens, the whole hebang. It was heavy. It was bulky. And going to the bathroom was a full operation. But the key to warmth was layers. A well-dressed woman in winter might wear linen smock or kirtle-fitted gown, overgown, or surcoat cloak, or mantle hood, and cap, thick woolen socks, leather shoes, possibly stuffed with hainnet, fashionable by modern standards, but very good at keeping the cold at bay. Sort of the rich versus the poorers with most things medieval. Your winter outfit depended a lot on your wallet. The wealthy could afford multiple layers, imported fabrics, fancy fur, and even colored wool dyed with rare, expensive dyes. They might have tailors or servants to help dress them, and they had fires in nearly every room. The poor had to make do. Maybe one tunic, one cloak, one pair of shoes. If it got damaged, they patched it. If it got wet, they dried it by the fire. If they had one, old clothes were passed down, over and over, until they were little more than scraps. And in winter, people sometimes wore rags, just to add something between their skin and the cold. Clothes as blankets, and the coldest nights, people often wore their entire wardrobes to bed. No pajamas, just all the layers they could pile on. Sleeping fully dressed wasn't unusual. It was necessary. Blankets were expensive, and beds weren't always well insulated. So people huddled under cloaks, hay-stuffed mattresses, and each other. Body heat was a survival strategy. Sleeping alone, you'd better have a dog, or a sheepskin, or just a very large cloak, and the power of wool. Medieval layering. Fashion tip or survival guide. Here's the thing. Most medieval folks didn't care about looking good in winter. They wanted to not die of frostbite. So yes, sometimes their outfits were mismatched, bulky, awkward, and full of holes. But they made it work. Layer by layer, stitch by stitch, they wrapped themselves in whatever they had. And if it didn't quite do the job, well, maybe another mug of warm ale would. So the next time you slip on your fluffy socks, zip up your winter coat, and grumble about how chilly it is, just remember, at least you're not tying on a soggy wool hood with one mitten and half a shoe. The home front, fires, drafty walls, and the art of not freezing indoors. First impressions: cold, dim, and kind of damp. You walk into a typical medieval cottage. It's probably 1 or 2 rooms. The floor is made of packed earth, maybe straw-strewn, maybe not. The walls, wattle and daub, basically woven sticks covered in mud and manure or stone, if you were lucky. And the windows, just holes covered with oiled cloth or shutters. Glass was for churches and the rich. Translation: drafty. very drafty. Rain could sneak in. Cold air slipped through every crack. And insulation. Never heard of her. The heart of the home, and also a fire hazard fireplace or simple fire pit in the center of the floor, was the one true source of warmth. Everything revolved around it. Families cooked over it, slept near it, sat around it to tell stories, spin, yarn, and heat their toes. But there was a catch. No chimney. In many homes, the smoke just floated upward, filling the room before hopefully escaping through a hole in the roof or a gap in the wall. So everyone lived in a constant state of smoky haze. Think campfire, but indoors, 24/7. Great for drying socks, not so great for lungs. The smell of winter indoors. Let's paint the scent picture. Imagine, wet or steaming by the fire, a pot of cabbage stew that's been reheated for 3 days straight. Feet. So many feet. Smoke, ash, and whatever the dog rolled in. And in wealthier homes, a faint whiff of chamber pot. Basically, the medieval winter home was less cinnamon candle and more barn with soup. Still, for them, it was home, and warmish, sometimes. Lighting. The long nights and winter. Daylight was precious. When the sun dipped below the horizon at 4 p.m., you were on your own. Candles were expensive. Rushlights, thin sticks dipped in animal fat, were cheaper, but smoky and fast-burning. Some people used oil lamps if they could afford it, but mostly, the fire provided both heat and light. So nights were dark. Families might gather close, sharing body heat, telling stories, or singing songs, then to bed early, not for rest, necessarily, but because what else was there to do? No phones, no books, unless you were literate rare. Just the fire, the dark, and the occasional mouse scurrying overhead. Beds and sleeping arrangements. Big of sleeping. Beds range from soft piles of straw to wooden frames with rope supports and a straw mattress. If you had extra money, you might stuff it with feathers or wool. If not, it was straw, maybe mixed with more. Families often shared beds. Mom, dad, kids, grandma, even the dog. In really tight spaces, people slept sitting up around the fire, leaning against walls or each other. Snuggling wasn't optional. It was how you kept your nose from freezing off. Blankets were precious. Cloaks doubled as bedding. Some folks used furs or just piled on everything they owned. Upstairs, not always a thing. Most peasant homes didn't have a second floor. Maybe a loft, if they were lucky, used for storage, sleeping, or hiding from the wind. But many lived entirely on one level, sharing space with animals in winter for warmth. The cows and chickens came inside. It wasn't just a nice gesture. Animals gave off heat, so housing them indoors meant a few more degrees of warmth. It also meant smells and noise. But hey, you've already got the cabbage stew and the smoky rushlight. Might as well throw in a cow to complete the atmosphere. Keeping out the cold, medieval home hacks. Here are a few tricks people used to stay warm indoors. Hanging heavy cloth over doorways and windows to block drafts. Laying rushes or straw on the floor for insulation, and maybe a mouse or two taping up cracks with mud, moss, or even animal dung. Sleeping in hats and gloves. Yes, even indoors, cuddling with pets or each other. Going to bed early, because sitting around doing nothing in the dark is freezing. Was it glamorous? Nope. Did it kind of work? Sometimes. Rich homes were slightly better. Slightly. If you lived in a manor house or castle, you had bigger problems. How to heat a massive stone building without going broke. Castles were drafty. Stone walls sucked up the heat. Windows were huge and glassless, so lords and ladies huddled, near fireplaces the size of small cars, draped themselves in fur and stayed in the warmest rooms. Servants lived in the colder areas. Surprise, some castles had tapestries on the walls, not just for decoration, but to help insulate. Floors were covered in rushes, and multiple fires might be kept burning all day long, an exhausting, expensive effort to keep fingers from turning blue. Illnesses and winter woes. Indoor winters also meant sickness. Close quarters, poor air, and low nutrition made homes a breeding ground for colds, flus, fevers, and worse. If one person got sick, the whole house did. And with no antibiotics, medicine, or much sanitation, a simple cough could turn serious fast. Doctors, if available, might suggest you drink warm ale or apply a poultice of morse. Not always helpful, but at least it was something. Still, people pressed on, because they had no choice. The comforts of the fire, despite the smoke, the soot, the coughing, and the goat in the corner. The fire was the heart of winter. Kids played by it. Parents whispered bedtime stories. Bread was toasted. Herbs were dried. Socks were warmed. Life happened there, crackling, glowing, dancing shadows on the walls. It was warmth, light, life. And for a medieval family, that fire was everything. So, as you rest tonight, far from smoky thatch roofs and damp straw mattresses, take a moment to appreciate the gift of central heating and walls that don't leak. Slippery roads and frozen rivers. Traveling in winter. State of the roads, more mud than path. Let's start with the roads, or, as they were known in winter, mud ribbons of despair. Most medieval roads weren't paved. They were dirt paths, worn down by feet, hooves, and the occasional cart. And in winter, those paths turned to slush, mud, or ice. Some roads turned into full-blown rivers of muck. Others froze solid, with ruts that could snap a cart axle in two. And many were completely impassable by anything with wheels. So what did people do? They walked. Walking, the default travel method. If you were poor, you walked. That's it. And not in nice boots or insulated socks, just in thin leather shoes, or sometimes even barefoot. If things were really dire, you trudged through snow, ice, and puddles. You slipped on frozen mud. You cursed every little rock. Travelers often carried walking sticks for balance and protection. Wolves and bandits weren't just bedtime stories. They bundled up in as many layers as possible, hoods pulled low, cloaks wrapped tight. And then, they just kept walking, because in the Middle Ages, if you had somewhere to be, no storm was going to stop you. It might delay you, or frostbite your toes, but it wouldn't stop you. Carts, carriages, and the wheel problem. No. If you had a cart, congratulations. You probably had a horse or ox to pull it, too. That's the good news. The bad news: wheels and medieval winter do not get along. Wooden wheels would get stuck in mud, freeze to the axle, snap from stress, refuse to turn in icy ruts. Plus, there were no road crews salting the streets. If a snowstorm hit, the cart stayed put, or, worse, slid into a ditch and took your entire supply of onions with it. Only the richest people had closed carriages, and even those were rare. Most carts were open to the elements. Sitting in one during a winter journey meant wind chill, bumpy terrain, and possibly being thrown off if the horse spooked at a snowflake. Frozen rivers, nature's highways. And trapped. Strangely enough, winter did offer one strange advantage. Frozen rivers. When rivers froze over solid enough, they became ice highways. People could skate, sled, or simply walk across, avoiding the muddy roads. It saved time. It was faster and sometimes smoother than the ground paths, but also risky. Too thin ice could crack and send you plunging into freezing water. horses and carts sometimes fell through. People occasionally misjudged their route and ended up stuck halfway across a river, shivering and praying for divine intervention. Still, when the ice held, it was one of the few perks of medieval winter travel. You could glide across the landscape like a very cautious thyself with cold feet, sleds and sleighs. For the lucky few in northern regions, think Scandinavia, Russia, and parts of the Alps, snow was deep and constant, so people adapted by using sleds and sleighs. Sleds were low wooden platforms pulled by animals, usually oxen or horses, and sometimes dogs. They were surprisingly effective. No wheels meant no getting stuck in snowdrifts. Plus, you could pile goods on them: firewood, food, passengers, the occasional pig. In fact, in deep winter, sleds were often better than carts. If you had one, you were in for a slightly smoother ride, though not any warmer. Of course, most common folk just drag stuff themselves. But hey, we do what we can. Inns, taverns and places to rest. If you found one, long winter journeys meant you needed places to stop. But here's the catch: inns weren't everywhere. Some villages had a tavern or guest house, others didn't. And if you were caught between towns at dusk, you had two options: knock on a stranger's door and hope they were kind, sleep outside, and risk turning into a medieval ice sculpture. Some travelers brought cloaks or first asleep in barns. Wealthier ones traveled with attendants or even tents. But for many, travel meant unpredictable sleep, questionable food, and a very real chance of waking up next to a goat. Hazards on the road. More than just cold. Winter travel wasn't just about staying warm. There were other dangers. Bandits loved catching lonely travelers, especially in the half-light of a snowy evening. With fewer people on the road in winter, it was easier to ambush and disappear. Wolves, yes, real wolves were a threat in some areas, especially in Eastern Europe and the forests of France or Germany. If food was scarce, they could get bold, and of course, there was the threat of getting lost. Snow-covered landmarks, paths disappeared. If fog rolled in or a storm hit, you might find yourself circling the same frozen tree until nightfall. Maps, rare signposts. Fewer still. You had to know where you were going, or at least follow someone who did. Religious pilgrimages. In the snow, surprisingly, people still went on pilgrimages in winter. Yes, people voluntarily walked across Europe to visit holy shrines in the snow, sometimes barefoot, sometimes in penance. It was cold, exhausting, and deeply spiritual. Some were on pilgrimages to cure illnesses, escape sins, or seek blessings. Others were just trying to make it to the local monastery before Christmas. So if you passed a barefoot figure trudging through a snowstorm, muttering prayers and dragging a staff, don't worry. That was just your average 14th century holy wanderer, probably freezing, definitely determined, staying safe. Travel tips. Medieval starlets. Say you were planning a winter trip. Here's your to-do list. Leave at dawn, because daylight disappears fast. Bring food, light bread, dried meat, or cold porridge. Wrap everything in wool, yourself included. Travel in groups, safety in numbers, and warmth. Carry a stick or knife in case of wolves or bandits or both. Don't trust thin ice. And if it starts snowing heavily, turn back. Seriously, because once you're caught in a medieval snowstorm without shelter, your odds go from bad to pray for spring. But still, people mothered despite the risks, the freezing temperatures, and the misery. People still traveled. Merchants, messengers, priests, farmers, soldiers. They all had places to be. And somehow, they got there, slowly, bumpily, coldly, but they got there. because life didn't pause just because it snowed. And in its own way, that's kind of admirable, or crazy, or both. So next time, playing about scraping ice off your windshield or waiting for your Uber in the snow, just remember, at least you're not dragging a sled full of turnips through a blizzard with wet shoes and a suspicious wolf following behind. Sleep tight. And in our next chapter, we'll peek into what people actually ate during the long, bleak, frozen season. Hint, hope you like cabbage. The winter table. What people ate and didn't eat during the cold months. Alright, tuck yourself in and imagine this. A long winter night, a small smoky cottage, and a big wooden bowl of cabbage soup. Yup. Welcome to the medieval winter diet. Food during winter wasn't just about flavor. It was about survival. You couldn't just walk into a shop and buy fresh apples or order hot food. If you didn't plan ahead during the summer and fall, winter might mean long, hungry days staring at an empty pantry and some suspicious turnips. So tonight, let's raid the medieval kitchen and take a slow, sleepy look at how people fed themselves during the frostiest part of the year. First rule of medieval winter eating: no fresh food if it didn't grow underground or wasn't dried, smoked, salted, or pickled. You weren't eating it. Fresh fruit, gone. Greens, forget it. Milk, only if your cow didn't freeze or stop producing. Eggs. Chickens don't lay much in the cold. So what did people eat? Let's dig into the menu. The soup. Live soup. So much soup. Thick, watery stews made with whatever was on hand. Cabbage, onions, beans, dried peas, old bits of meat, maybe a carrot if you were lucky. Often, the soup would be kept on the fire all day, constantly simmering. If it got low, just add more water, or more cabbage, or both. The flavor, probably somewhere between earthy and please don't ask, but it was warm. It filled the belly, and that's all that mattered. Bread. The realm of bread was the staple of the medieval diet, especially in winter, but we're not talking crusty, bakery fresh loaves here. Medieval bread ranged from coarse brown barley loaves to hard, dry slabs made from rye or oats. Some poorer folks added things like ground peas, beans, or even sawdust to stretch the flour. Yes, sawdust. Not great for digestion, but better than starving. Bread might be eaten cold and dry, soaked in soup. To soften it, toasted on a stick over the fire if you were fancy. Sometimes stale bread was used as a plate, called a trencher, and then eaten afterward. No waste here. Root veggies. Galarife. It grew underground and stored well. It was a winter hero. Say hello to onions, turnips, parsnips, carrots. The weird, lumpy medieval kind beets, garlic. These were stored in root cellars, cool, dark, underground pits that kept veggies edible for months. By January, they might be a little soft, but hey, throw it in the stew and call it dinner. Cheese, butter and milk. Sometimes dairy was tricky in winter. Cows gave less milk, or stopped entirely. Cold weather made churning butter difficult, and fresh dairy went bad quickly without refrigeration, but clever folks preserved it. Cheese could be made in summer and eaten all winter. Butter was salted and stored in jars. Milk usually turned into something else quickly. For the poor, dairy was rare and precious. For monks and manor-folk, more available, but still seasonal. Meat, a rare winter treat. Most medieval peasants didn't eat meat regularly. It was expensive, hard to store, and often reserved for feasts. But in winter, you might see salted pork or bacon if you butchered a pig in autumn. Dried or smoked fish, cured sausages, jerky-style beef or venison. The rich had access to fresh game: deer, boar, rabbit, hunted on their lands. The poor, maybe a scrap of meat in the stew once a week. Maybe not. And yes, salted meat was often very salty. Sometimes they soaked it 4 hours just to make it edible again. Yum, fish Fridays, and Wednesdays, and length as a fun twist. The church said no meat on Fridays, and sometimes Wednesdays, and definitely not during Lent, which often fell in late winter. That meant fish was important, but not fresh trout on a plate. Think pickled herring, dried cod, smoked eel. Weirdly, gelatinous fish. Peas monasteries often had fish bombs just for this reason, and coastal areas fared better. Obviously, still, fish was a key protein during long meatless weeks. Even if it tasted like old boots. Fruit, only if you planned ahead. Winter fruit equals whatever you managed to dry, preserve, or pickle in autumn. That included dried apples and pears, pickled plums, raisins, if you had access to grapes, fruit leathers, fruit preserves, if you had sugar, or honey. Sugar was wildly expensive. Most peasants used honey sparingly, so winter wasn't very sweet, unless it came from fermented apple cider. Which brings us to ale, cider, and liquid food. Water wasn't always safe, so people drank ale, not the strong kind we know today, more like a low alcohol, slightly bubbly grain drink. Cider was common in apple growing regions. Mead was more of a treat, and wine was mostly for the wealthy or monks. Sometimes ale was warm and served with spices, a kind of medieval mulled drink, very comforting, slightly gross, but comforting. And sometimes people just drank warm broth or pottage, liquidy stew, as a kind of meal in a mug. Table manners and feasting. Very rarely, while most meals were simple and eaten by hand, there were winter feasts. Christmas, for example, was a big deal. Even poor families might save a chicken, bake special bread, or make a sweet pie with dried fruits. Rich lords went all out, roasted animals, whole pigs, swans, or peacocks, spiced wine, candied fruits, enormous pies that sometimes contained live birds. Don't ask, but that was once a year. The rest of winter, back to cabbage soup and dry bread. Hunger and hardship fears the hard part. If the harvest had been bad. If your stores ran out, if your livestock died, or your flour spoiled, winter could become dangerously lean. People went hungry, some starved, others stretched meals as far as possible, watering down soup, rationing bread, boiling old bones for broth. In the worst cases, families turned to eating grass or bark, grinding acorns, trading clothes for food, begging from the church. There were no supermarkets, no heating, no food delivery, just whatever you had or could find until spring came. And yet, they endured spit, the hunger, and the bland food, and the eternal cabbage stew. People survived. They made do. They shared meals with neighbors. They preserved traditions, like baking bread on Sundays or feasting on Epiphany. They told stories around the fire, and they counted down the days until Lent ended and spring crops returned. And maybe, just maybe, someone found a forgotten apple at the bottom of the cellar. A miracle in its own tiny way. So tonight, as you lie there dreaming of midnight snacks and stocked fridges, give a silent cheer for the winter survivors of history, and for the miracle of central heating and late-night pizza. Next up, we'll explore something even more intense: warfare and military life during a freezing medieval winter. Yes, people fought wars in the snow. What could go wrong? War in winter, battles, sieges, and soldiers in the snow. So far, we've explored frostbitten farms, drafty houses, and cabbage soup. But what if, on top of all that, you also had to fight a war? Imagine being a medieval soldier. You're already hungry, underpaid, and wearing armor that pinches in weird places. Now add snow, frozen toes, and the joy of sleeping outdoors when your water flask turns into an ice cube overnight. Medieval winters were brutal enough, but going to war in one, that's a special kind of misery. Let's take a slow, sleepy march into the coldest corners of medieval conflict. Fighting season. Not really. Here's a fun fact. Medieval warfare wasn't meant to happen in winter. Armies typically campaigned from spring through early autumn, when the roads were passable, the weather was warmish, food was available, no one froze to death, while putting on chainmail. Winter was the off-season, a time to retreat, rest, or recover. But like many things in history, sometimes plans went out the window, especially when someone decided, hey, let's lay siege to a castle in December. Why? Well, the winter siege, misery on both sides. Sieging a castle was hard enough already. You had to surround it, cut off supplies, wait it out, sometimes 4 months, occasionally throw dead animals over the walls to spread disease, gross but true, and do it in blizzards. With no food, while sleeping on frozen mud. Soldiers outside the walls suffered from hypothermia, frostbite, hunger, disease, low morale. Big surprise, but the people inside the castle didn't have it much better. As the siege dragged on, their food dwindled, their firewood ran out, and their water froze solid. Add fear and boredom, and you've got a recipe for cabin fever. Medieval style, cold steel. Literally, armor didn't help much in the cold. Chainmail got icy and stiff. Metal helmets gave you brain freeze. Touching your sword with bare hands. Hello, frostbite. And padding didn't help either. It absorbed sweat during the day and turned freezing cold at night. Soldiers often slept in their gear, shivering in tents or under trees. Also, have you ever tried using a bow in the snow? Wet bowstrings snap, arrows misfire, and good luck aiming with numb fingers. Let's just say, winter was not great for archery practice. Horses, wagons, and snow-covered roads. Transporting an army in winter was like herding goats across a frozen swamp. Roads turned to mud or disappeared under snow. Carts got stuck, broke down, or froze in place. Horses slipped, got sick, or just gave up. And because supplies were slow, troops often went without food, spare clothes, blankets, dry socks. A medieval dream. Sometimes they just followed frozen rivers instead of roads, because at least the ice was flat until it cracked, feeding the army. Good luck an army marches on its stomach, right? Too bad there wasn't much to eat in winter. Fields were bare, animals were scarce, and stealing from nearby towns didn't help. Everyone else was already starving to. So soldiers ate moldy bread, boiled leather shoes, ate horses as a last resort, or just didn't eat much at all. Malnutrition made soldiers tired, weak, and cranky, which is not ideal when someone's trying to stab you with a pike. Morale in the mud, cold, hunger, and exhaustion made people desert. Who could blame them? You're freezing, you haven't eaten, your sword is rusting, and the guy next to you just sneezed something concerning. Desertion wasn't just common, it was expected. Kings and commanders often lost half their armies before they even reached the battlefield, and those who stayed, they mostly just tried to stay alive, pass the time, and hope spring came quickly. Famous winter conflicts. Not all wars avoided. Winter. Some of history's coldest showdowns include the Siege of Chateau Galliard, 1203-04. King Philip II of France laid siege to this castle in the dead of winter. Freezing rain, hunger, and disease ravaged both sides. The defenders suffered terribly inside. It ended in February, just in time for spring. And more fighting. The Scottish campaigns, the English and Scots often fought across cold, rugged terrain. Marching through snowy highlands, not easy, but they did it anyway, with predictable misery. The Baltic Crusades Knights of the Teutonic Order waged holy war in the snowy lands of modern-day Estonia and Latvia. Frozen lakes, icy forests, and blizzards didn't stop them, but it did make everything much harder. These weren't heroic winter wonderlands. They were cold, wet, and exhausting. Camp life in the cold when not fighting. Soldiers built makeshift camps. Tents, if they had them, were flimsy and cold. Fires were essential, but fuel was scarce. Bodies were crowded together for warmth and safety. Sometimes they used straw or hay for insulation. Other times, they just piled on whatever cloth they had and prayed for morning. Songs, dice games, and storytelling helped morale. But mostly, it was waiting. Cold, hungry waiting. Winter gear, kinda. There was no military issue parka. But soldiers tried their best. Wore cloaks, extra tunics, fur-lined boots. If you were lucky, straw stuffed in shoes, gloves. Rare. And valuable knights might wrap themselves in layers of linen, wool, and fur under armor. Common soldiers wore whatever they could find, often rags tied around feet and hands. Everyone dreamed of dry socks, but no one had them. Strategy and Delamany leaders avoided winter warfare for good reason. Campaigns were postponed, battles were delayed, and truces were signed, not out of kindness, but because no one wanted to fight in a blizzard. Let's wait for spring was both a military strategy and common sense. Still, sometimes winter couldn't be avoided. A surprise attack, a desperate siege, or an unlucky retreat could throw everyone into the snow. When it happened, history remembers the bravery, but not always the cold toes. And so, the snow fell. Picture a frozen field, a half-buried catapult, a tent flapping in the wind. Somewhere, a soldier tries to light a fire with numb fingers. Another curls up under a wet wool blanket, dreaming of warm bread and a home he hasn't seen in months. This was winter at war, not glorious, not heroic, just cold, hard, and quiet, broken only by the crunch of boots on snow. So tonight, as you rest under your soft blankets in your heated room, send a sleepy salute to the frozen fighters of history. They didn't have thermal gear. They barely had boots, but somehow they endured. Faith in the frost, the church, winter saints, and sacred comforts. Picture this. It's the middle of January. The wind is howling outside your tiny cottage. Your fire is down to a few glowing embers. There's no meat left, no vegetables, and your neighbor just traded their boots for a sack of oats. So what do? You walk through the snow to the little stone church in the center of your village. You step inside, and there's warmth, candlelight, singing, a flicker of hope, maybe even a holy day feast. Because in the Middle Ages, faith was a lifeline, especially during winter. Let's take a soft, sleepy journey through how medieval people used religion to cope with the coldest, harshest months of the year. The church was the center of it. All medieval life revolved around the church, and not just for Sunday service. It was the community gathering place, a provider of charity and food, a calendar of holy days and festivals, a source of comfort and meaning. Church bells marked time. Priests gave news and read official announcements. And when the world outside was freezing and dark, the church was often the only place that felt stable. Plus, churches were stone buildings. Cold, yes, but also solid. And they had candles. Lots of candles. Winter holy days. A full calendar winter. Wasn't just one long frozen slog. It was also packed with religious holidays, each one offering a little cheer, ritual, and meaning. Here are a few big ones. Christmas, December 25th, not just a day, often a 12-day festival. Celebrations included mass at midnight feasts. If you had food, plays and pageants, singing and storytelling, giving alms to the poor, it was less about presents and more about light in the darkness. The birth of hope, quite literally. Feast of the Circumcision, January 1st. Yes, it's a bit odd by name, but it marked the start of the new year and a time of prayers for good fortune, better harvests, and maybe a slightly warmer February. Epiphany, January 6th, celebrating the arrival of the wise men, big in many regions, sometimes even bigger than Christmas. It involved feasting, costumes, parades, and baked goods. A jolly end to the winter holiday season. Since of the cold winter had its own lineup of patron saints, ready to protect you from frostbite, wolves, and, well, everything else. St. Nicholas Bear, he became Santa. St. Nick was the patron saint of children and the poor. His feast day, December 6th, involved gift-giving and secret acts of kindness. People prayed to him for protection during long, hungry winters. St. Scholastic, often associated with storms and severe weather. If a blizzard was coming, you might light a candle in her name. St. Blaise, patron saint of sore throats. Useful when you're constantly breathing cold air and coughing in a smoky hut. St. Eulalie, invoked against frostbite. Seriously, people would pray to her when their fingers started going numb. The medieval world was full of saints for every situation, and winter brought out the need for their help more than any other season. Charity and alms. Church wasn't just a spiritual center, it was often a lifeline for the poor. Monasteries baked extra bread. Alms were distributed after services. Leftovers from feasts went to the hungry. Some abbeys had almoners whose full-time job was giving to the needy, and while charity didn't fix poverty, it offered brief relief, a warm meal, a shared fire, a blanket, a prayer. Many villagers survived winter thanks to church charity, sometimes barely, but it mattered. Candles, hymns, and quiet moments. Medieval religion wasn't all sermons and rules. It was also ritual, beauty, and stillness, a powerful comfort in hard times. Candles flickering in dark stone chapels, hymns echoing through icy air, prayers whispered over steaming bread, statues of saints wrapped in tiny cloaks. Yes, that was a thing. Nuns and monks chanting in rhythm, with the snow falling outside. Even just sitting in a chapel could bring peace, a moment to breathe, to remember that winter didn't last forever. Monks, nuns, and winter devotion monasteries didn't shut down in winter. In fact, they kept running like clockwork. Prayers at dawn in total darkness, work in the scriptorium with frozen inkpots, feeding the poor, brewing ale, reading sacred texts by candlelight, and they offered a model of stability. While the rest of the world froze and struggled, monks and nuns held on to order, rhythm, and calm. Their daily routines were comforting just to know about, even if you weren't part of the monastery yourself. Pilgrimage. Maybe not right now. Some brave souls made pilgrimages in winter, but most waited for spring. Still, local shrines were popular. People would leave offerings, coins, bread, tiny wool cloaks, light candles for loved ones, ask for healing or warmth, or hope. These small acts of faith helped people feel less alone. Even in the dead of January, miracles, legends, and hope. Winter was the season of miracles, or at least stories of them. A loaf of bread that fed an entire village, a saint's statue that wept during a snowstorm, a cloaked monk who healed a frostbitten child with a prayer, a candle that stayed lit through a blizzard, whether true or imagined. These tales gave people strength when you're cold, tired, and unsure where your next meal is coming from. Believing in something, anything, makes a difference, and still, they believe it even when frost covered the fields and wolves howled at night. People lit candles. They knelt on cold stone floors. They sang songs in Latin they didn't fully understand. They whispered hopes into the silence. And somehow, that helped. Faith didn't end winter. It didn't fill every belly, but it made the cold more bearable. A flicker of warmth in a world of ice. So tonight, as you lie in your soft, warm bed, maybe say a quiet thank you to the generations who found light in their darkest season, who rang bells in the snow and hoped for spring. Next up, we'll be heading into the world of medieval crafts and trades. How people made things, fixed things, and worked with frozen fingers in icy workshops. Frozen fingers, busy hands, winter work and craftsmen. Okay. Picture this. It's a grey January morning. The fire burned out sometime around 3 a.m. You wake up to your breath fogging the air inside your own house. Your hands are stiff, your feet are numb, and the roof is making some very suspicious creaking noises. So, what do? Well, you go to work, because even though nothing grows and everything's frozen, the medieval economy doesn't take snow days. People still had jobs, and the icy world didn't care if your fingers were too cold to hold a hammer. Let's take a slow, cozy wander through the kinds of work people did in winter, and how they managed it without gloves, central heating, or caffeine. Winter was indoor season. Sort of. Winter didn't mean a break. It just meant different kinds of work. Farmers didn't have fields to plow or crops to harvest, but they still had tools to repair clothes, to mend grain, to grind animals, to care for firewood, to chop and for craftspeople, the shoemakers, blacksmiths, weavers, and wheelwrights. This was their busy season. In many villages, winter was when the craft industry came alive. Wool, looms, and cold tossen of the big winter tasks. Woolworking, spinning wool into thread, weaving that thread into cloth, sewing the cloth into garments. Spinning wheels and looms didn't need good weather, just a steady rhythm and some patience. You'd sit near the fire, or as close as possible, and work while your breath misted in front of your face. Wool was everything: clothing, blankets, cloaks, even stuffing for shoes, and it was often the work of women, older villagers, and children, anyone with hands warm enough to keep moving. The tricky part: wool smells like wet sheep. Always has. Always will. Blacksmithing in the cold. Blacksmiths didn't get winters off. Horses still needed shoes. Tools still broke. Iron still had to be shaped. But imagine trying to work with fire when your workshop is a stone shed with no windows and a door that won't close properly. Smiths relied on hot forges, glowing coals, and sheer stubbornness to keep warm. Their hands cracked from heat and cold. Their breath steamed in the air. Sparks flew, sometimes landing on frost-covered floors, but they were crucial. No blacksmith, no plows in spring, no knives for the kitchen, no weapons for the local lord. Woodworkers and carpenters with the fields quiet. Woodworkers stepped up. Axes were sharpened, carts were fixed, wheels were built or repaired, handles for tools were shaped with care, some folks chopped and split firewood, an endless job in winter. Others built sleds or mended fences. It was cold, loud, and full of splinters, but the smell of fresh cut wood that helped a little. Shoemakers, bless them, nothing wore out faster in winter than shoes. Mud, ice, snow, and salt tore through medieval footwear like angry wolves. So cobblers as shoemakers were always in demand. They patched sawless, stitched seams, and sometimes stuffed straw inside boots to help folks limp through to spring. Leather got stiff in the cold. Needles snapped, but no one wanted to walk barefoot in January. Shoemakers might not have been glamorous, but they were heroes, quiet, hunched-over heroes with very cold fingers. Preserving, brewing, and indoor kitchen work. Winter was also a time for kitchen crafts. Salting meat, smoking fish, brewing ale, drying herbs, making candles from animal fat. Women especially stayed busy in cold kitchens, preparing what little food was left and trying to stretch it. This meant boiling things, a lot of things, root, vegetables, bones, random grains. If it could be thrown into a pot, it was. Ale brewing was a serious winter task. It took warmth, careful watching, and lots of patience, and everyone loved the person who made the beer. Textile work, stitch by frozen stitch needlework, and sewing didn't stop in winter. In fact, it ramped up. New cloaks and tunics had to be made. Blankets were patched, socks were sewn. Bless you, sock sewers. Embroidery added beauty and warmth. This was slow, quiet work done in groups around a fire. People would talk, tell stories, hum songs, and stitch by the soft light of tallow candles. Was it glamorous? Nope. But was it essential? Absolutely. The tools of winter work. Winter jobs came with special tools and special problems. Frozen hammers, left outside by accident, equals very bad surprise. Rust, cold air plus damp tools. Hello. Iron eating, doom, brittle thread, snap, 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 ink freezing. Scribes literally had to warn no inkpots near candles before writing. Even axes and saws had to be carefully handled. Wetwood plus cold steel was a recipe for splinters, cracks, or worse. Guilds and the crafting community in towns and cities. Craftsmen were often part of guilds, little medieval clubs for people who did the same job. These guilds helped set prices, train apprentices, support widows and orphans, throw feasts, because even cobblers needed to party during winter. Guilds were a lifeline. If a shoemaker froze his fingers or a potter broke a leg on the ice, the guild helped out. And during holidays, they paraded through the streets, showing off their work. Sometimes in costumes, sometimes with music. It wasn't all hard labor. There was community too. And at the end of the day, you'd finish your shift. Your hands were raw, your knees ached. You'd probably gotten more soot, dust, or sheep hair in your mouth than you'd care to admit. You'd shuffle home, step over slush, and try not to slip on the icy mud. Then maybe, just maybe, there'd be a hot drink waiting by the fire, some barley broth, a blanket that still held a bit of warmth, and a moment of peace before the next frosty morning. Winter work, quiet glory. Medieval winter work wasn't flashy. It didn't make legends or headlines, but it kept people alive. It was careful, steady, humble labor, done by firelight, by candle, with stiff fingers and aching backs. It was the quiet rhythm of survival, hammering, stitching, carving, brewing. And in its own frozen way, it was beautiful. Wolves, bandits, underworld, snowy nights, dangers after dark. So, you've made it through another long, cold day. You've fixed your shoes, boiled your cabbage, said your prayers. Now it's time to get some rest, right? Not so fast, because night time in a medieval winter was when the world got weird and dangerous and just a little bit haunted. Let's tuck into our blankets and gently peek into the kinds of threats that came crawling, howling, or sneaking through the snow once the sun went down. Don't worry, we're safe now. But back then, not so much. Nights were really dark. First, we've got to talk about the dark. Modern dark is not that dark. We have street lamps, phones, nightlights, TVs glowing faintly in the other room. But in medieval Europe, dark was pitch black, especially in winter, when the sun disappeared before dinner. Cloudy skies meant no moonlight, and snow could muffle sound so well. It was like the world just stopped, unless you had a torch, messy and smelly, a lantern, expensive, a candle, short-lived, or a very good memory of where the tree stump was. You weren't going anywhere after dark. Wolves were relays. Start with the obvious one. Wolves. They weren't just a storybook villain. They were everywhere in medieval Europe, especially in the forests of France, England, Germany, Poland, and pretty much all of Scandinavia. Wolves were smart, fast, hungry, and not shy about coming near villages when food was scarce. In winter, they followed livestock trails, travelers, even funeral processions. Yes, really, they could smell the dead. One medieval law in France even paid bounties for wolf pelts. That's how serious it was. And sometimes, just to keep things spicy, villagers blamed wolf attacks on werewolves. Naturally, bandits, thieves, and desperate soul-slits say you're on the road in winter, delivering grain, maybe, or visiting a neighboring village. Bad idea. Highways and woodland paths were dangerous all year round, but in winter, even worse. Bandits knew that travelers were carrying food or coin, had fewer places to hide or run, were easier to track in the snow, so they waited in forests, or near bridges, or at crossroads. They didn't have to be Robin Hood-style outlaws either. Sometimes just a desperate farmer who hadn't eaten in today's. And with no police force, your only hope was traveling in a group, hiring an armed guard, or just staying home, which, frankly, was the smarter choice. Ghost stories and snow spirits. Let's step into the spookier stuff. Winter, with its long nights and icy silence, was the perfect breeding ground for ghost stories and folklore. People believed in wandering spirits of those who died in the cold, snow witches who cursed your home if you didn't sweep the hearth, frozen fairies that stole bread and licked frost onto windows, and of course, the Wild Hunt, a ghostly procession of riders in the sky, sweeping down in storms to steal souls. You think a howling wind was just the wind? Try telling that to someone in 1350, and hey, if your ox died in the night or your bread turned moldy, it had to be somebody's fault. Animal noises in the night. Ever heard an owl scream? It doesn't hoot. Not really. Some owls sound like someone being murdered in the woods. Add in foxes yowling, dogs barking, worldly wind creaking through trees, wolves howling in chorus, and you've got the soundtrack to a medieval horror movie. People didn't understand animal sounds the way we do now. Every creepy noise outside could be a ghost, a witch, a demon, or something worse. Best not to check. Plague, fever, and death at night. It wasn't just what came from outside that frightened people. There were plenty of threats indoors. Winter was peak time for lung infections, coughing fits, fevers, sudden death, and when people died in the middle of the night, which they often did, it felt eerie, unnatural. You'd wake up and find someone cold, still, and silent in the bed next to you. So of course, stories spread. Maybe it was a sin, or a curse, or the devil himself. Some even said the cold invited evil in. The role of light. People fought the dark with light, but it wasn't easy. Candles were made of tallow, animal fat, smoky, drippy, and didn't last long, so people used fireplaces, oil lamps, and even glowing coals in clay bowls to light their way. They would place lights near windows to keep spirits out, burn herbs to ward off sickness, hang charms or crosses over doorways, sleep close together for warmth and comfort. There's something kind of beautiful about that, actually. a little glow, a little hope. Animal attacks. Not just wolves got the headlines, sure, but other animals could be dangerous too. Boars in the forest, aggressive and unpredictable wild dogs scavenging around towns, bears, less common, but a huge threat where they existed, even rats, spreading disease in warm parts in some regions. Stray cats were even feared as witches, familiars, or omens of death. Basically, if it had teeth and came out at night, people were wary of it. And rightly so. Staying safe at night. What did people do to stay safe during these long, dangerous nights? Barred the doors with wooden beams, slept in shifts, if needed, kept weapons by the bed, pitchforks, axes, clubs, slept with livestock indoors for warmth and security, protective candles, and said prayers before bed, avoided travel at all costs, and if something did go bump in the night, you just stayed under the blanket and hoped it was a goat. The comfort of the hearth. Despite all this, people found peace at night too. A crackling fire, a bowl of hot soup, a lullaby, the soft breathing of family nearby. They told stories, shared warmth, dreamed of spring. Even in a world full of wolves and whispers, there was comfort in closeness. And sometimes the scary sound outside just turned out to be a clumsy chicken. So as you drift off tonight, spare a cozy little thought for the villagers who whispered prayers by candlelight, wrapped themselves in cloaks, and hoped the night would pass without howls. And remember, you're not sleeping in a hayloft above a frozen pigsty, so you've got it pretty good. The first thaw, hope, spring, and the end of the freezer. There's a moment, usually sometime in March, maybe early April, depending on where you lived, when the wind doesn't quite sting your face anymore. The snow hasn't melted yet, not fully, but the edges of the ice start to soften. Water drips from the eaves, birds return, tentatively, and for the first time in months, you can walk outside without your bones shaking from the cold. Welcome to the medieval thaw. It didn't come fast. It didn't come easy, but when it came, people noticed, and they rejoiced, quietly, humbly, the way medieval folk did everything. Because after months of cold, fear, darkness, and hunger, spring meant survival. The melting begin slits set the scene. You step outside your cottage, and the first thing you notice is a strange, wet, squishing sound. The ground is still frozen underneath, but the top layer is turning to mud. Glorious, messy, sticky mud. There are puddles, slush. The ditches overflow with meltwater. And yet, it's beautiful. The air smells like earth again, not smoke, or old straw, or turnips. Earth. It's the scent of things coming back to life. Signs of spring. One tiny leaf at a time. Medieval people didn't have apps or forecasts, but they watched nature very closely. And these were the signs that spring was waking up. Snowdrops and crocuses pushing through the frost, the first fly buzzing near the fire, ravens cawing differently in the morning, buds on bare trees, butter churns dusted off for the first milk, the ground finally soft enough to dig a little. Some of these changes were so small you'd miss them today, but for people back then, they were huge. Each little thing meant you made it. You lived through it. Longer days, warmer light. Spring didn't just smell different. It looked different. The sun started rising earlier, hanging longer in the sky, and casting warm, golden light instead of that cold, silvery winter glow inside. People started cracking open windows just a bit to let the stale air out. Cloaks got lighter. Fires were smaller. You could go outside without 5 layers of wool. Chickens clucked more cheerfully. Children played again, cautiously, in muddy courtyards. It was like the whole village exhaled, cleaning, sweeping, scrubbing. The weather allowed it. Households dove headfirst into what we now call spring cleaning. You think your junk drawer is bad? Imagine 6 months worth of ash, straw, mud, soot, mold and, occasionally, frozen rat droppings. Everything was swept out, beaten, washed, or burned. Bedding was aired out, walls were scrubbed, windows were scraped. It wasn't just hygiene. It was symbolic, clearing out the shadows of winter, making space for life again. Animals come back to life. To livestock, poor things, had barely scraped through the cold months. Cows were skinnier. Sheep looked like matted rugs. Pigs were grumpy. But once spring came, milk flowed again. Chickens laid more eggs. Horses breathed easier. And goats, well, goats were always weird, but at least they were happy. Some animals even gave birth in early spring, meaning the whole barnyard would be filled with bleats, peeps, and tiny wobbling legs. The farm felt alive again. Fields, ploughs, and hope. Spring was not just a season. It was a job alert. As soon as the ground thawed, ploughing began. Seeds were sown. Fertilizer, yes. Manure was scattered generously, and everyone prayed for a better harvest than last year. You could smell the soil, rich and dark. It was hard work, muddy, backbreaking, hopeful work. But after a long winter of staring at turnips and wondering if your toes still worked, any outdoor task felt like a gift. Religious holidays and Ringwall Spring also brought Easter, which was huge in the medieval world. It symbolized rebirth, forgiveness, new life. Both physical and spiritual altars were decorated with flowers. Bells rang joyfully. People fasted, then feasted. There were processions, plays, and sometimes, rare and wonderful, fresh bread. It was a time of light, in every sense of the word. Saying goodbye to the cold. You know that one pair of thick wool socks you wore every day all winter. Time to take them off. Or, at least, wash them. People gradually packed away their heavy cloaks and cloistered hats. Thatched roofs got patched up. Ovens were cleaned. And the villagers slowly emerged from their sleepy, smoky homes like bears blinking in the sun. Everything hurt a little less. Even the aches in your joints eased up. And though everyone knew that spring came with its own problems, floods, illness, bugs, taxes, it still felt like hope. A quiet kind of joy. Spring in the medieval world wasn't about frolicking through meadows or Instagramming flowers. It was sitting on a bench in weak sunshine, eyes closed, watching your child run barefoot in the mud, listening to frogs in a stream, feeling your belly full for the first time in months. Watching green blades poke through dark soil. It was survival turned into celebration. Not loud, not flashy, but deep, honest, real. Life always comes back even after the darkest winter, with its wolves and frozen toes and endless soup. The world turned, the sun came back. So did the rain, the wind, the grass, the animals, the laughter. People planted again. Children grew taller. Old folks nodded quietly and said, "We've made it through another one." And then they got back to work, because next winter was only ever a few months away. So, if you've ever stared out your window at cold grey skies and wondered if the warmth would ever come back, know this: it always does. It did for them. It will for us.